Imagine a man who looked at the single most valuable inheritance in all of human history, a covenant sealed by God himself, a promise stretching across thousands of years, and traded it away for a bowl of hot soup. Not a kingdom, not gold, not even a particularly remarkable meal, just soup. And what makes this story so terrifying is not the trade itself. It is what came after it. Romans 9, verse 13 carries a sentence that God declared before either of the two brothers had even drawn their first breath. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is not metaphor. This is a prenatal declaration of divine judgment spoken over an entire bloodline before a single action had been taken. The descendants of that man, the Edomites, went on to block Moses and 2 million people from passing through their territory. They stood on the walls and cheered while Jerusalem was razed to the ground. They chased down the survivors of the most catastrophic day in Israel's history and handed them over to the enemy. And then, centuries later, one of their own did something far more dangerous. He changed his name, converted to Judaism under the force of a sword, worked his way into the highest levels of political power, and was eventually crowned king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. His first act against the true king was to order the systematic execution of every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2. The war that started inside a mother's womb had followed the Messiah all the way to his cradle. How does a bowl of soup become a 2,000-year war against God? How did an Edomite end up wearing the crown of Judah? And the most unsettling question of all, where are the Edomites today? Because the Bible is very clear, their story is not finished yet. This is the complete deep dive into the Edomites. Let's get into it. Bell, if this kind of deep biblical history is what you've been looking for, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We go where most channels are afraid to go. Now let's continue. Rebecca is pregnant, and something is wrong. The children inside her are wrestling, colliding, fighting in a way that terrifies her. She goes directly to God and asks what is happening. The answer she receives is one of the most extraordinary prenatal prophecies in the entire Bible. God tells her that 2 nations are inside her womb, 2 peoples who will be separated from birth. One will be stronger than the other, and, most strikingly, the older will serve the younger. Before either child has made a single moral choice, God has already announced the outcome. The Apostle Paul later used this exact moment in Romans 9 to build his argument about divine sovereignty, a concept that is as uncomfortable as it is undeniable in the text. The first child arrives red, deeply, strikingly red, and covered in hair almost like a garment. The Hebrew word is admoni, meaning ruddy. His name, Esau, relates to his hairy appearance. But the identity that would define his descendants for millennia came from another word, Edom, meaning red. He was born red. His territory would be red. His legacy would be red. And every time that color appears across this story, from the red stew to the red cliffs of Petra to the crimson-stained garments in Isaiah 63, it marks another chapter in the unraveling of a bloodline. Jacob follows his brother out of the womb, gripping Esau's heel. His name means heel-grabber, supplanter. 2 brothers, 1 womb, 1 war already begun before the midwife has finished her work. Years later, Esau returns from the field exhausted and hungry. Jacob is cooking a thick, deep red lentil stew. The Hebrew text is almost theatrical about the color. Esau says in essence, "Give me some of that red stuff right there." The Hebrew repeats it, "Ha-Adam, Ha-Adam, the red, the red." The text is shouting the color at the reader, demanding attention. Jacob names his price without hesitation, the birthright. Not a trinket, the birthright. The double portion of the inheritance, the patriarchal authority, and most critically, the covenant line running from Abraham to the coming Messiah. The promise of land. The promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. The ultimate promise that all nations on earth would be blessed through this bloodline. Esau's response is one of the most consequential sentences in human history. "I am about to die anyway, What good is a birthright to me? He was not about to die. He was hungry. He was tired and inconvenienced and unwilling to wait. And yet he bartered an eternal covenant for a temporary meal. The text delivers its moral verdict with surgical precision. So Esau despised his birthright. He did not lose it. He despised it, looked at it, weighed it against what was in the pot, and decided the stew won. The color was already telling you the price. Genesis 27 brings the next fracture. Jacob deceives his aging, nearly blind father Isaac and takes the patriarchal blessing before Esau can receive it. When Esau arrives, the text records something genuinely heartbreaking. He cries out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. Isaac's hands are empty. The blessing is irrevocable. And Esau's first response is an immediate death threat. When my father dies, I will kill my brother Jacob. But here is the detail that makes everything that follows even more devastating. Years later, when Jacob returns from exile fully expecting to be attacked, something unexpected happens. Genesis 33, verse 4. Esau runs to meet Jacob, throws his arms around him, and kisses him. They weep together. They later bury their father Isaac side by side. The personal wound between these two men was healed. Esau forgave. But the reconciliation between the fathers did not reconcile the nations they produced. The sons made peace. The nations never would. And that is what gives every subsequent chapter its devastating weight, because it did not have to be this way. Esau was not an irredeemable monster. He was a man who made choices, and whose descendants inherited the spiritual trajectory of those choices, a generational current of resentment and resistance that would not stop until God himself closed the case. The nation born from Esau's line took his defining color as their name, Edom, the Red. Esau settled in the rugged mountain terrain of Seir, south and east of the Dead Sea, in what is modern-day Jordan and southern Israel. Genesis 36 catalogues their descendants, their chiefs, their clans, and their kings in meticulous detail. This was no obscure, struggling tribe. Edom had a functioning monarchy with an organized line of succession before Israel had ever crowned a single king. The landscape of ancient Edom is almost theatrical in its natural defenses. Towering red sandstone cliffs rise hundreds of meters from the desert floor. Narrow canyon passages, some barely wide enough for a single file of soldiers, connect the interior to the outside world. A handful of disciplined guards could hold back an army of thousands in these natural choke points. The capital city, called Sela in scripture, later known as Petra, was carved directly into rose-red cliff faces, a city literally built inside the mountain. The color followed them everywhere. Red stone, red earth, red walls. But Edom's power went far beyond military defensibility. They controlled the King's Highway, one of the most critical trade arteries in the ancient world, connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia directly through their territory. Every caravan carrying spices, incense, copper, and gold had to pay Edomite toll. They extracted tribute from the traffic of civilizations, grew absurdly wealthy, and that wealth calcified into arrogance, the specific arrogance of people who believe their advantages are permanent. God described it through the prophet Obadiah. You who live in the clefts of the rocks, you who say to yourself, "Who can bring me down to the ground?" Their topography had become their theology. They believed the mountains made them untouchable. They were wrong. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, he sent a carefully worded diplomatic request to the king of Edom, appealing to shared brotherhood, calling them your brother Israel, asking only for safe passage, promising to stay on the main road, pay for any water consumed, and leave absolutely nothing disturbed. It was a humble, almost deferential appeal. The kind of request you make when you genuinely believe the other party will remember that you share the same grandfather. Edom refused. Not with a negotiation. Not with a counteroffer. A flat refusal. When Moses sent a second request, because apparently the first was not convincing enough, Edom mobilized a large army and marched to the border to ensure the point was made with force. The blood descendants of Esau, the literal extended family of Israel, slammed the door on 2 million people who had just survived generations of brutal forced labor. This was not a border dispute between strangers. This was a cousin telling his cousins to turn around and die in the desert. And this pattern of rejection, aggression, and deliberate hostility toward Israel became the defining template for every Edomite interaction with the covenant people over the next 8 centuries. King David conquered them with campaigns of staggering military intensity. His general Joab spent 6 months systematically hunting down Edomite fighting men throughout the captured territory. But even that did not break the line. A young Edomite prince named Hadad, a baby at the time of the campaign, smuggled out by servants, was raised in the Egyptian palace, married into Egyptian royalty, and returned decades later as a divinely appointed adversary against Solomon. The line of Esau was too embedded in the covenant story to be simply removed by military force. For 800 years, Edom raided, revolted, and struck at Israel from the south, battle after battle, generation after generation. And from this same bloodline came another name the Bible never lets us forget: Amalek, the grandson of Esau, the ancestor of the nation that ambushed the sick and the elderly trailing behind the Exodus column, the bloodline that produced Haman in the book of Esther, the man who nearly succeeded in the total elimination of the Jewish people. Amalek was Edom's own flesh, the same ancient rage distilled into an even purer and more ruthless form. But nothing the Edomites did across 8 centuries of open warfare compares to what they did on the single worst day in Israel's history: the day Jerusalem was destroyed, the day Edom danced. It is 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar's army has been besieging Jerusalem for nearly 2 years. The city is starving. Lamentations describes mothers cooking their own children for food. When the walls finally break, Babylonian soldiers pour through and begin the systematic destruction of everything Israel held sacred. The Temple of Solomon is stripped of its gold and reduced to rubble. The Ark of the Covenant disappears from recorded history on this day. The surviving population is bound and marched into captivity. And Edom did not stand back in sorrow. Psalm 137, verse 7 preserves the grief-soaked cry of Jewish exiles beside the rivers of Babylon. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. They were there, cheering, calling for the total demolition of a city built under the covenant blessing their ancestor had sold for soup. The book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. 21 verses, every single one of them aimed at Edom. This is God dedicating an entire canonical book to the prosecution of one people for one day. Read the charges. You stood aside while foreigners looted your brother's wealth. You entered his burning city. You seized his belongings in the day of his disaster. You cut off his fugitives at the crossroads. You handed the survivors over to the enemy. 6 specific charges, 6 specific verdicts. The prophet Amos, writing independently, corroborated. He pursued his brother with a sword, stifling all compassion, because his anger raged continually and his fury flamed unchecked. 3 devastating phrases. The violence was unrelenting. The compassion was deliberately suppressed. And the rage had been burning for centuries, passed down, never surrendered. Number 1. The verdict of Obadiah. Obadiah 1. Verse 10. Because of the violence you did to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame and destroyed forever. No conditional. No way out. A permanent sentence. Number 2. The law of divine symmetry. Obadiah 1, verse 15. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. What they called down on Jerusalem would be called down on their own fortresses. Number 3. The 5-prophet convergence. No other nation in biblical prophecy receives this level of sustained attention. Obadiah, Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Malachi. 5 independent voices across multiple centuries, all converging on Edom with the same verdict. This is not a footnote in prophecy. This is not a footnote in prophecy. This is a cross-generational coordinated prosecution. But Edom did not simply collapse. It did something far more dangerous. It changed its identity. After the Babylonian exile, the Nabatean Arabs pushed the Edomites out of Petra and Seir. The red cliffs they boasted were impenetrable fell to desert nomads, exactly as Obadiah had promised. The displaced Edomites migrated west into the Negev and southern Judah, settling around Hebron, the very land Abraham had purchased and Jacob had inherited. The Greeks renamed them Idumeans. Same blood, same ancient hostility. New label. Around 125 BC, Hasmonean king John Hyrcanus I conquered them and issued an ultimatum: convert to Judaism or leave. Circumcision at sword point. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded it in full detail. Entire populations were absorbed into the Jewish nation, not by faith, but by force. The Idumeans became Jews in name. But the blood, the spiritual orientation of Esau's line, was now operating from inside the walls. Within one generation, an Idumean family had infiltrated the uppermost levels of Jewish political power. Antipater the Idumean became chief advisor to the Hasmonean kings. His son moved between competing factions, built relationships in Rome, and in 40 BC, the Roman Senate voted him a title that by every scriptural right belonged exclusively to the bloodline of David. His name was Herod. They called him King of the Jews. An Edomite, a descendant of the man who sold his birthright for soup. The blood that God declared would serve the younger was now sitting on the throne of the elder, not through covenant, but through political manipulation and Roman appointment. Herod was a man of extraordinary, terrifying contradictions. He rebuilt the temple on a scale that made Solomon's original look modest. Some of the retaining wall stones he used weighed over 500 tons, engineering that still staggers archaeologists today. But this was not devotion. It was political theater, compensating for a claim to the throne that no Jewish person in Judea would ever genuinely accept. He knew they knew. He was an Edomite wearing Jewish robes, buying loyalty with architecture and crushing dissent with violence. He executed his wife Miriam, a Hasmonean princess he married specifically to legitimize his reign, and by most ancient accounts a woman of remarkable intelligence and dignity, on charges that historians have largely viewed as paranoid fabrication. He arranged the drowning of his 17-year-old brother-in-law Aristobulus in a swimming pool, staging it as a swimming accident in front of witnesses. He executed 3 of his own sons. Augustus Caesar reportedly remarked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, since Herod, as a nominal Jew, would not eat pork and therefore would not slaughter a pig, while his children clearly enjoyed no such protection. The paranoia reached its absolute peak when foreign astrologers arrived in Jerusalem and asked one question: "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Matthew 2, verse 16 records the response: execution orders for every male child in Bethlehem 2 years old and under. An Edomite king, a descendant of the man who despised the birthright, whose people had pursued Jacob's line with a sword for 8 centuries, who had danced when Jerusalem burned, was now ordering the elimination of infant boys to destroy the Messiah himself. The war that had begun when 2 brothers wrestled inside their mother's womb had crossed 60 generations and arrived at the exact manger where Jesus Christ lay sleeping. The rage of Esau had not weakened across 2,000 years. It had disguised itself, repositioned itself, and come within a breath of succeeding. Herod died in 4 BC of a consuming, agonizing disease. His dynasty collapsed within a generation. In 70 AD, Rome destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and scattered the Jewish people across the known world. And the Idumeans, people who had been Jews for barely a century, simply vanished from the historical record. No Idumean exile. No surviving community. No nation on any subsequent map bearing their name. 3 theories account for where they went. The first is complete absorption, that the Idumeans were gradually assimilated into the Jewish population across generations, with no ethnic boundary remaining by 70 AD. The second is the rabbinic coded reference. In Talmudic literature, Edom, became a typological symbol for Rome and later for powers that opposed the Jewish people throughout history. Not an ethnic claim, but a theological and literary one. The third is the prophetic view, which may be the most significant of all. The Bible does not describe Edom's story ending in a quiet demographic absorption. 5 major prophets describe an eschatological judgment against Edom that has not yet occurred. Jeremiah chapter 49 promises God will expose every fortress and every hiding place. Ezekiel chapter 35 dedicates an entire oracle to Mount Seir, calling out what God names ancient hostility. Not a political dispute, but a generational, deliberately maintained hatred that was never repented of. And Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, closes the Hebrew Scriptures with God's own words. Esau I have hated, and I have turned his hill country into a wasteland. They may build, but I will demolish. Present tense. Future tense. The verdict still standing. Isaiah sees a figure approaching from the east, from Edom, garments stained crimson. From beginning to end, the color is the same. Esau was born red. The stew was red. The cliffs of Petra are red. Herod's hands were red with innocent blood. And the final figure in this saga comes from Bozrah, the ancient capital of Edom, with robes soaked in red. Many theologians identify this figure as the returning Messiah, and the location is not Jerusalem. It is Edom. Obadiah 1, verse 18 delivers the verdict the entire book has been building toward. The house of Jacob will be a fire and the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau will be stubble, and they will set it on fire and consume it. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. No survivors. Total judgment. And according to the prophets, still not yet fulfilled. The final chapter of the war that began in Rebekah's womb is still being written. Now step back from the history for a moment. You just traced a bloodline that lost everything. And the origin of that loss was not a battle. It was not a miscalculation. It was not God being unjust. It was one man on one ordinary afternoon, looking at the covenant of Abraham, the promise of land of the Messiah himself, and making a 5-word decision that sealed the fate of his entire lineage. What good is it to me? Esau was not dying. He was hungry, inconvenienced, tired. And in that moment of ordinary discomfort, he looked at an eternal inheritance and decided it was worth less than what was in the pot. What makes this so dangerous is that it was reasonable. The stew was hot and real and immediate. The covenant was future, invisible, abstract. The hunger was now. The promise was someday. Esau did not feel like he was making a catastrophic decision. He felt like he was being practical. And that is exactly what makes this story a mirror held up to every generation that has read it since. What birthright are you trading right now? Not in some grand theological abstraction you can keep at arm's length, but actually, concretely, this week. The career that pays well but is slowly costing you your family. The relationship that feels good but is pulling you away from everything you were actually called to. The comfort that demands nothing of you while your calling sits in the corner collecting dust. These are not dramatic, cinematic decisions. They are ordinary decisions. Sunday afternoon decisions. And Esau made his on a perfectly ordinary afternoon when he was just a little bit hungry. Hebrews chapter 12. Verses 16 and 17 delivers the final word. See that no one is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. He wanted it back. He sought it with tears. But the transaction was final. There are some moments, once surrendered, that do not return regardless of the grief that follows. The Edomites had every opportunity across 2,000 years to choose differently. At every crossroads, the door was open, and at every crossroads, it was refused. The birthright was never really about the stew. It was about what Esau valued. And the judgment of God on Edom was not arbitrary cruelty. It was the accumulated consequence of a people who chose, generation after generation, the immediate over the eternal. The story of Edom is a mirror, and the question it puts back to you is the same one Esau answered on a perfectly ordinary afternoon with a sentence that changed everything. What are you choosing today? If this video opened up something in Scripture you had never seen before, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me what moment hit you hardest. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the next video goes even deeper. God bless you, and we will see you in the next one.